I will be moderating our panel discussion, Mission Readiness in the New Normal. Just a bit about me. I am a senior manager with Grant Thornton, and I oversee our public sector federal budgeting solution in conjunction with overseeing multiple projects geared toward enabling informed, data-driven decision-making and really turning data into actionable business intelligence. We're going to discuss that and more today, but before we do, wanted to quickly talk about what we mean by mission readiness. I'd like to acknowledge that we're not just speaking about mission and readiness in the military or the Department of Defense perspective, but really more broadly to cover an organization's ability to understand, plan, and then proactively act to fulfill its core mission responsibilities, even and especially in the face of disruptions as permeating as the current pandemic. But certainly other disruptions or impacts that yield a major change in circumstances. And then it's about sustaining that readiness and organizations being able to quickly convert not only data, but other insights into an agile and dynamic, well-informed decision-making framework that's really about not only the near term, but the long term. And then ultimately it's knowing where you are, where you're going, and then whether you're on the journey or when you get there, knowing how to effectively assess success and return on investment so that you can plan and then prioritize again for the future. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. All are experts and practitioners in the space, and I'll get started. Moshe, do you want to get us going?
Sure, thank you, Felice. I'm Moshe Nelson. I'm a principal with Grant Thornton. I lead our asset management practice, which within the public sector, which focuses on all of our services related to facilities, personal property, truly the infrastructure that is necessary to run government and public sector operations. So it's a key service area, particularly in relation to mission readiness. With that, I'll turn to Kevin for his introduction.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Brathwaite. I'm a director in the public sector practice with responsibility for delivering our resource optimization solutions. And a key component of resource optimization is looking at workforce analytics and staffing modeling, which is critical in assessing the requirements for mission readiness, identifying the resources needed, determining the impact of changes in mission demand on the resource requirements. So looking forward to this conversation this afternoon.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jared Moon. I'm a manager with Grant Thornton. A lot of experience working with both Moshe and Kevin in asset management efforts, as well as in staffing analysis. And a lot of the work that I do really brings that together within supporting strategic planning and mission readiness for the agencies that I work with.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. And I do want to encourage participants, certainly ask questions throughout. We're going to try to make this as conversational and discussion-based as possible. So don't hesitate to ask questions as we move along, and we'll, as we can, be able to address them accordingly. So just getting started, wanted to start with that foundation, right, the baseline. And Kevin, we can start with you. Just what are some of the instances where we've seen agencies implementing mission readiness on the ground, and how do you see that manifesting itself? How are people responding to it?
I think when we think about mission readiness, I see there are three big factors or three big themes that we see impacting the agency's experience and driving how they're able to respond to it. And the first one is the extent to which there's either a robust framework already existing, or at a minimum a baseline understanding of how resource requirements are linked to the delivery of the mission, and not just in terms of just getting the work done, but in terms of meeting the expectations of leadership or the customer base, whether it's internal or external customers, and also the extent to which there's what I characterize as a dynamic means of updating requirements as mission needs change. A lot of what we'll be looking at is certainly in the face of mission today versus mission prior to being in the COVID scenario, and I'm going to use that lens. But I think this is applicable to looking at missions and your ability to be ready in the face of any exogenous impact to it. So the second factor is the inherent characteristics of the mission in terms of the delivery mechanisms, the extent to which the mission, the services can be delivered remotely, the extent to which they need to be delivered at in person or at the point where the services are demanded. That does impact the state of readiness, and also the extent to which, even in the face of remote delivery and the possibility of remote delivery, the extent to which the existing culture and structures in an organization were set up to allow that. So we've seen in some instances, even though services may be delivered remotely, there was a culture where there was an expectation of not being remote, pretty much being in person. And as things start to evolve, managing that change process and managing the culture shifts that were needed, that's something that's also impacting readiness. And finally, there's the sensitivity of the mission fundamentals to external changes, and that is, as changes occur, to what extent will the demand for the services provided by the agencies change? Are they going to spike? Are they going to stay normal? And also the extent to which, even if they're going to stay normal, the extent to which the workforce that's available to deliver on those services, is that also changing? So I've seen probably about 3 different responses, and this is in no means intended to be an exhaustive list, but there's been new or increased visibility into the importance of internal supply chains. So very often the primary focus of mission delivery gets the attention, but as the situation has evolved, we're seeing the internal support services and understanding how those internal support services are impacting readiness and impacting an agency's ability to get its mission executed. That's become a lot more important. The extent to which services can be reprioritized. So you look at the delivery of services. Does it all have to be done at once, or is there the possibility to grow a backlog of work that needs to be done? So identifying those things that are truly mission critical, that must get done, and anything that can be deferred in the face of restricted resources. I see that happening as well. And there are rapid response teams being established to deal with specific issues that arise. And I know Moshe's going to delve into this in a little bit. And then one example that I did see recently, and this gets back to having a pre-existing robust framework to be able to assess requirements. As the needs change, the organization had already invested in a resource requirements effort where they had a robust staffing model in place. And so as the requirements started to change, they were able to look at how were the drivers of the work changing, input that into the model, and they were able to respond very quickly to the needs that were impacting the agency.
So certainly, if an agency or an organization had the infrastructure, the framework in place pre-pandemic, they would have definitely been able to in a more agile fashion deal with some of those impacts. I know that you mentioned supply chain, and certainly some of those deferrals, right? But some things aren't discretionary, and certainly whether it's the pandemic or other impacts, there may be other things that come to the fore that are that come in that become mission core needs. Moshe, from your perspective, how have you seen that play out, and certainly from the asset side as well, from that non-personnel perspective, and what do you think is important from that foundational?
Sure. There's great points that Kevin made here. I think there's been some specific drivers of change that have existed within the past decade that have made mission readiness more important, as well as have enabled agencies to rapidly change infrastructure, data, and requirements effectively to respond to changes in the, we'll call it the ecosystem of asset management in the environment. So when we look at major natural disasters, such as hurricanes or pandemics or changes in migration patterns or economic changes, the entities that have been, I would say, used to utilizing resources in a resourceful fashion that oftentimes have been underfunded and therefore have developed a culture of being agile and utilizing key levers at hand have sometimes been even more effective than those who have been institutionalized with infrastructure that is not as responsive, right? They're not essentially creative. So let me talk about a few levers that enable such creativity and responsiveness. We talked about in the asset management and infrastructure side, technological change. So how have we been able to utilize new technologies that give better line of sight for rapid movement of, we talked about logistics and supply chain, or even asset utilization. We're in an unprecedented time with COVID, and the fact that individuals have moved to a remote environment and still maintained operations across the federal government in a way that has manifested itself in status quo mission readiness, as well as resiliency, is a testament to technological innovation. And if one establishes themselves with a system that identifies those drivers of the technology infrastructure, as well as the data management. And the third piece here is utilizing strategic analytical insights that enable you to rapidly move and deploy assets effectively, then the agencies can be successful. So I think that there are some key elements and key drivers that we need to discuss and have to essentially invest upon to uphold good effective mission readiness. The technology, the data management and curation, as well as effective analytical tools that enable us to move assets from place to place.
Right. So this all sounds great, right? And Jared, I think I'd like you to speak to, what if we're starting from square one, right? What does that baseline look like if you didn't have the infrastructure in place? If you didn't have some of the framework in place, whether from the the workload modeling or the asset modeling or management perspective, where do you start, and how do you get to at least step one in that basic sense of the journey?
Yeah, a lot of things that we see with some of the agencies that I work with is, while they don't really think about it, there are existing data points that they can start with. A lot of the things, if you think about from a staffing perspective, you have time entry. In some cases, you may actually have workload data that shows what is getting done and where, and how that aligns to specific requirements for different mission needs within the agency. So building up that understanding and starting to get an understanding of where your staff are, what they're doing, are they understaffed, are they meeting those mission requirements, and being able to start to put that together in some sort of analytics platform where you can just get that baseline understanding of what's going on, that's huge. And once you start doing that, you can also start looking at asset data. One thing that we look at a lot is vehicles. We have a lot of good information on where vehicles are, what types of vehicles you need, what those specific vehicles do for different pieces of the mission. And you can then even start to connect that to your staff and say, do we have the right types of vehicles, the right types of training and staff by location, by mission type? And you start to bring all that together, and it can help inform that readiness. Where do you have deficiencies in capabilities to meet what you're trying to do by location? And then that informs so much else. It informs budgeting. Do we need to acquire more assets or just move existing assets from one location to another? And then also connecting that to the strategic plan itself. So you get a more formalized agency structure of what you need, and you can connect it from that strategy to budget requests and be able to create more data-driven budget requests that will hopefully be more likely to get accepted as they move up through that budget justification process.
Great. So if you have a baseline, you've established some type of work breakdown structure or a way to define your personnel or your non-personnel needs. If you're geographically dispersed, you've got at least a decent sense of where things are. You've gotten to a place through data, through surveying, through any type of, if not necessary, subject matter expertise to get to that step one, right? When you're there, what does that roadmap look like? So as you want to then engage in maturity, what are some of the pillars of that process, and how do you prepare for it? Moshe, would you like to begin?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It goes back to, from the asset management perspective, understanding what the holistic view is of your infrastructure. Jared talked about understanding where, in one case, fleet are located, the utilization data, the sometimes automated data points, as well as assumptions that need to be developed. So, understanding the asset laydown, the location of the data, the taxonomy, the standardization, what are your key drivers or data points that can be coalesced in order to start making those data-driven decisions? And then ultimately the questions that need to be answered. Well, I think what we have to also understand that it's a system process. And in our asset management practice, we look at asset management as a system, right? So it's not just the infrastructure and assets, but it's the resources, human capital, budget and finance, and technology that are involved, as well as the processes. So understanding those key elements will enable you to build models that affect operations and enable you to make those key decisions that will enhance mission readiness.
So Kevin, given that, we know that if you're defining something, you want to make it repeatable and you want to make it sustainable. Tell us a little bit about some of the criteria, the maturity criteria that you look at when delving into an organizational assessment or analysis that ultimately leads to kind of that definition of workforce or organizational need.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the factors that Moshe mentioned that we look at in asset management apply to workforce, because the workforce is a resource as well. One of the things that we think is always important, though, is understanding the delivery process, or even the customer journey, if you will, in terms of what is it that the agency is required to deliver. And even within the agency, if we're looking at component parts, what are the key things that need to be delivered? And then working backwards from there, what is that journey that drives the need for that particular output, that particular service? And we look to understand each of those steps, and in that journey, what are the workload drivers? What are the triggers that cause that? How does it manifest itself into workload, which ultimately impacts the amount of the level of workforce that you're required to deliver. So we try to understand that journey. And as I mentioned at the beginning, looking at not just the primary or the direct drivers, but looking at those support services that are required to deliver. IT, human resources, acquisitions, facilities, all of everything that comes together that says this is what it takes to deliver this service. Understanding that becomes very important. And once it's laid out, being able to capture the data that's associated with each of those each of those points. And I think from what Jared said earlier, it's like if you're at that baseline where you haven't done this before, it can be intimidating, but recognizing that there's a need to start somewhere, and recognizing what we've certainly seen this, that often the data that's required to support the types of analyses that would be needed, it's often, or more often than not, I should say, it's generated somewhere. It's just not collected. It's just not harvested because no one's ever asked for it or needed it in that position. So as you lay out your what we characterize as that journey map, we understand that all of the factors that are required to support a particular output. We then look at where the data sets that are associated with that, and we put that plan in place. We want to get something that is repeatable. For it to be repeatable, we do need to have it documented. For it to be repeatable, you need to be able to have reliable data, so that if you run the analysis today, you run it a year from now, and you're using the same types of data coming into it, the assumptions with the assumptions unchanged, you should be getting useful information or consistent information. The other thing that that's important is having that authorized version of the truth, if you will, so that as you look at different data systems across an agency, if you are pulling the data from different places and you're not identifying that formal version of it, the information that comes out into reports will be different, will be inconsistent. It's probably not going to have a high level of utility. So credible data sources, approved, accepted data sources would be one. Repeatable processes would be a second one, and also developing repeatable tools that are where forecasting is possible. Because if you develop the tool, it's a one-off study. You put all sorts of information into it, but then you want to look forward. What happens in 3 years? What happens in 5 years? If the inputs into that analysis or model are not easy to forecast in the out years, then the model really has limited utility, and its ability to provide repeatable information is going to be limited.
So actually, Kevin, real quick, let's pull that thread a little bit on repeatability, and we'll get Jared in here as well. But when you mentioned when there isn't data, right, or you don't perceive there being data, it may be collected somewhere. Tell us a little bit more about that, and if you're a stakeholder in the audience that wants to start somewhere, right, it has to start somewhere. What are some strategies for if there isn't a case management system or a data system in place, especially if you want to get to that same sheet of music, one voice approach? What would you recommend?
A couple things. One, again, laying out that process is very important, because having that the end-to-end view of what you're studying is important. But then using subject matter experts. I mean, those are the individuals who are performing the work. They know how it's done. Absent any other information, get the information from the practitioners who are performing the work. And that, in order to do that, again, if this hasn't been done before, it's very important to structure surveys or structure interviews to elicit the type of information that you will need to get to that understanding of data. The other thing that we also encourage is, as you're recognizing that the first pass with minimum data is going to give you that baseline, be identifying those points where data can or should be collected, where it's being generated but not recorded, or where it can be generated if we're identifying the right points in the process. So that would be the second thing. The third thing would be to consider external benchmarks for similar functions. And very often, we may run into the situation where there's no comparable organization doing exactly the same thing. But if you start to decompose the organization into its constituent functions, or even decompose a function into its constituent parts, there there potentially can be comparable components in other places that can be used as a benchmark. So those would be three things I would say to start. Collect information from subject matter experts, look for external benchmarks, and start identifying what a more robust data collection plan should be.
Got it. I see a question coming through here. How do you determine if an agency is mission ready or activity based regarding operational support? So if an agency is mission ready or activity based regarding operational support. So there are a couple ways we can go with that. Moshe, do you want to start with
Sure.
that baseline? Are we ready? And then how do we get to that activity based?
Sure. And we've seen different agencies address this differently based upon what mission they are set out to accomplish. One great example that I've seen in an instance was looking at from an asset management perspective, the availability of assets to complete the mission. So understanding what the essential baseline is for the assets that are needed to run operations or deliver medical services, for example. In other cases, it was the training capabilities of resources that are providing the mission, right? So they were measuring mission readiness by how much of my personnel have taken X amount of training that is required to do their job effectively. So that was another measure of mission readiness. And then, a third, example is, of course, from the information technology realm, right? What's the uptime on given information technology infrastructure to ensure that operations can continue, which this day and age is the essential backbone for any agency's function. So looking at it in those terms of defining the metrics that are necessary to complete operations, ensuring that you're aligning your assets and determining benchmarks, that would enable effective mission readiness. Like, do I need 98% availability in my assets, or will 80% suffice? And do my resources have the right training to be able to conduct their job? Are good ways of determining a mission readiness. They are not the only, but they are some examples.
And one more to think about too is the idea of are you getting the work done, and if yes, how are you meeting the metrics that are set up? Again, expectations of leadership, expectations of the customer base served, and one question we often ask is, well, what's not getting done? What should be getting done that's not getting done? And if, as you go through that list of things that should be getting done and it's not getting done, and there's a so what to it, what's the impact of not doing that work? That can also give be a good indicator as to whether or not you're currently situated to be ready to execute on your mission.
And one last thing I just add to this, thinking about building up that data set and that baseline, it is very important to understand your operational support. That could include support staff positions that may not necessarily do that frontline mission work, but do have an impact on the success rate of that frontline mission work. And in a lot of cases, there's not great data on that. So leveraging your subject matter experts, maybe doing some surveys to see if that mission support is providing the right amount of support to the frontline staff, and maybe what the gap is there, if they'd like more of that, kind of like what Kevin mentioned with that missed workload need. But then in addition to that, once you have that understanding, maybe you may want to implement some policies on data entry for that support staff. And one of the agencies I work with actually did that. And we were able to see that that support staff actually doubled the likelihood of success for each of those frontline mission activities. And that's a huge thing to plug into budget request for more of that support staff. And then as you understand that, you can also get into future optimization analysis by leveraging potentially even some forecasting analysis, thinking about external workload drivers. If anything is sort of predictable based upon what you've seen from maybe partner agencies that you work with, workload they may be providing to your agency, factor that in. If you have a partner agency that maybe is adding more staff, which could impact your workload, that's something that you can add into your analysis. And again, connecting it from that front line to that support staff, those activity requirements, like what was mentioned in that question.
And I think that's a great segue into the other question that just came through. Key areas, specific key areas an agency should determine when deciding if they should be a mission ready agency. Now, I would argue that all agencies should likely focus on mission readiness, no matter the mission or the goal set, especially if you're appropriated and you're trying to define and communicate and justify resources. But I'd like, Jared, if you can pull the thread on what you just mentioned and really talk about some of the big picture factors to consider, even as we think about mission readiness and some of the risk factors associated with that. We talked broadly about personnel, non-personnel, but what if we key into some of those areas in terms of that readiness? What should an agency do?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to an agency deciding if it is mission ready, well, you have to have that measurable capability to say that. And I know it's a long process. If your agency is currently sort of new in this process, it may take a little time to get there. But beginning to build out that understanding of what you have, where is it? And then once that's understood, and once you're connecting that to the outputs of the mission that the agency performs, starting to iron out, where are we mission ready? And then the next step is what does that mean for the value that the agency provides to the government, to the American people? What are we really trying to do? And can the resources that we have meet that need? And can we be predictable in how we can plan out that need 2 years in advance for a budget, 5 years in advance for a strategy, and then being able to connect it back to all that data that you've built up?
And just to piggyback off of that, I think it's a requirement today that planning and analytics be scenario based, right? Our world is changing, and we are living in a dynamic environment where strategic plans that have linear recommendations over the next 5 years are often obsolete after year one. So ensuring that you build your structure, your data structure, your performance metrics around the capability to run scenarios and determine what those drivers of the scenarios will be is one of the key factors in being mission ready. Because if there's any constant, is that things change, and we have to be ready to for the next pandemic, the next natural disaster, the next change in defense posture or operations.
And one last thing to add to that is having that scenario capability helps your agency respond to questions that you may get from external stakeholders like OMB or Congress or other agencies. To help answer those questions, like if your funding is going to get cut for a certain asset type, well, what's the impact of that? How can you use that data on your mission readiness to help support why you actually do need to have that asset? And maybe if you even need more, and what the impact of it would be for the government, for the American people.
This is all great, guys. So we've talked a bit about that baseline. We've talked about maturity. We talked about what an agency does, right? How do you get the job done? What are the core functions that make up the work you do? what is that work? What are you delivering? What are your quote mission outputs? And then what are the activities or the tasks that it takes to get to there? And then on top of that, is there a time-based component that you can attribute to? So are we talking an FTE? Are we talking cycle time-based analysis? There's plenty of ways I'm sure we could get into the weeds on, but you need that baseline to even consider that scenario-based forecasting capability. But I'd like to get into that. So how do you optimize mission readiness, and not only at that higher level, but as you dig in, and it's not just nationally or at the agency level, right? It's at the programmatic level, at the unit level, section level. How do you start monitoring those impacts over time? And I think that will delve into the next question that I'm seeing come through as well. But can we speak, guys, to that at a high level to start? Kevin, would you want to start?
Sure. So I think having that initial framework that we talked about on the second question, which is looking at the almost in a vertical logic model, looking at what is it that you're set up to do, what is the expectation of again the agency, the suborganization, and any component within it, what is needed, what are the outcomes that are expected, and what are the outputs that are associated with those outcomes. So once that structure is there, that structure is known, that structure is agreed to, let's then take that horizontal logic model, that horizontal look. What does it take to really deliver on those outputs? What are the resources needed? What are the assets? What are the facilities? What's human resources? What technology is needed? And then actually studying that to understand, are you delivering on these outputs as optimally as you can, or are there better ways of doing it? And I think there was an earlier question around, what are some of the signs that you are or not mission ready? Well, if you start to look at the allocation of your resources, knowing what your priority outputs are, what the primary outputs of the mission should be, and you look at the allocation of the resources, if there's a disconnect between where resources are allocated or prioritized relative to what outputs are prioritized, that starts to give insights into where there may be room for improvement, where there's room for optimization. And there's the question of efficiency. Are you using your resources as efficiently as possible? But then also layering in technology tools to identify what are optimal ways of doing this. And depending on the level of data that's available, you can do prescriptive planning, you can do other types of scenario analyses that would be identifying what are the best ways of bringing this set of resources together in order to maximize the impact of the output. So we're seeing that very specifically in understanding where the resources are currently allocated, understanding where the resources are needed, and running analyses to see how those two things can be optimized to create the maximum benefit essentially for the agency.
Right.
And I say agency, and again, but that can be done at any level of the organization.
That's right. And to get to this, for the group here, the question is, where are you seeing resources are being moved from in order to make organizations mission ready? Are you seeing a trend? Now, I think broadly, mission is very different depending on the organization, the agency. So what I would argue that it may differ and vary depending on the stakeholder set in the organization. But I would like to throw that out to the team, Moshe, Jared, others. Are you seeing trends that would entail, what we would consider mission readiness?
I've got a couple specific examples. I mentioned the support staff impact. So we are starting to see one of the agencies I support, they're actually working to hire more support staff versus just all frontline mission staff because of the impact that they provide. It improves likelihood of success. It actually allows those frontline staff to focus more of their time on the mission versus doing things that a support staff person could do at a cheaper cost, which is important. But also it improves the throughput of those activities. So you're doing things quicker, cheaper, and you're getting better outputs by having the right staffing mix. That's super important. The other thing is thinking about a nationwide agency that provides support across the country. Some specific mission types are done more in certain locations than other mission types. So if a new priority comes up where you need to reallocate staff or staff's time to focus on that mission, maybe it's better to hire or place new staff in those locations that have the highest impact. And with this type of analysis that we do, we can see that and we can predict it and we can report on how it's successful over time. And then the last thing is within the agency, we've seen some agencies actually invest in building out their analytics capabilities by adding a small program office that actually focuses on building out these data sets, connecting them to mission readiness, working with the operational programs in the field to better define the business rules to inform those models and be able to inform leadership on recommendations for the best decisions to help out in optimizing their resources.
Great.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think I'd be remiss if not putting that question in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we've seen from our clients across the federal government is that it's essentially an inflection point. Are we operating or have we been operating in a way that truly aligns to the mission? And can we change to be able to address similar instances in the future, as well as find ways to improve, operations today. So when we took a look at what resources are necessary to do that, oftentimes you'll immediately go to the tangible, right? The facility space, the utilization, the IT assets. Cyber is as a necessity here to ensure that you can maintain operations in such an environment. But there are also very important areas that are softer, right? Cultural change. How am I going to be able to communicate with my staff effectively? Do we need to change our methods of communication? Do we need to start setting ground rules? How do I train people in their remote environment in a way that conveys ideas effectively? And oftentimes that's a bit different, depending upon the services that are being provided or the mission that's being accomplished, and often overlooked. So, I do want to state that even though I'm an asset management person, there's a significant amount of change management here that is required to make, mission agencies effective and mission ready in this new dynamic environment that we have, and they should not be ignored.
And I do want to underscore that the theme there on the support services, it was very prevalent there in what Jared said, because I think the scenario that Jared uses is the scenario, it's the way it should be done in terms of looking for ways to enhance your support functions, because if the support functions are there, it helps the direct functions move forward more effectively. But to the question on what happens with resources, I've also seen instances where there's a reflex to, I wouldn't say marginalize, but to not fund the support services and then place more funding into the direct services and not look at what it takes to support an enhanced workforce. So if you increase your direct workforce, that's an increase in HR services that's going to be needed. That's an increase in technology services. If you stand up a new facility in the field to deliver to deliver some capability, well, there is a level of infrastructure around that that's going to be necessary as well. And so it's very important that requirement doesn't get lost, even as we're looking at the more mission, quote unquote, mission critical functions.
And how has Kevin, Moshe in particular, how have you seen the efforts converge, especially during the pandemic? Can you offer some use cases? Like, PPE comes to mind, for instance.
Sure, we've seen in several instances, how agencies have quickly utilized, I would even say low-cost software and their current IT infrastructure environment to rapidly determine, what their inventory would be for personal protective equipment, which is a consumable and something that is traditionally very difficult to track because of the rapid usage of it. But agencies have effectively, utilized common software such as SharePoint and then analytical tools to layer on top to understand, what is the environment, the inventory environment? What does my consumption look like? How can I forecast the need in the 30, 60, 90-day period, as well as make resourcing decisions? How much do I need to procure and what should I shift? Now, once you get past the point of just maintaining operations, I think you start to look into optimization. I know Kevin has some thoughts in regards to that.
Absolutely. So as Moshe said, once you've stabilized, if you will, in terms of you're pulling that data together to inform your day-to-day decisions, there is looking at opportunities then to determine how best to stage, how best to allocate your resources out into the future. Because if you're in a situation where the demand is changing very quickly, the demand can be in different parts of the country, and that can change over the course of a week even. How do you make sure that you've got the right resources in the right place to be able to support the demand? And we, developing again pretty low cost tools to be able to show what's that optimal way of moving, staging resources, moving them around, but also to help predict, forecast where is your demand likely going to be greatest and where is there likely going to be a huge gap between your current supply and your current demand. That's a natural second step, if you will, to having that initial baseline of understanding where your resources are today.
So ultimately, it's about understanding your organization's workforce, its programs, its data integrity. It's then hopefully connecting and then communicating across levels to inform planning efforts, utilizing some of the data analytics strategies we talked about to balance those resources and those requirements and as well as risks, scale those analytics as you continue on that roadmap to guide and hopefully inform those data-driven decisions across the enterprise, and then hopefully continually reassess those mission impacts and those priorities, and setting up the infrastructure that I think Moshe and team discussed, really remaining agile as things become overtaken by events, because they inevitably will. Any closing thoughts from the panel? I think we've got 30 seconds here. So with that, happy to have been here and participated. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to the audience, to the Performance Institute, and we appreciate having the time to discuss.